Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States with the director of the Virtual Center, Dr. Bill O'Brien. Here's your host, Dr. Bill.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today on this Wednesday, and I can honestly say that it's a delightful afternoon because for the first time since Sunday, it's not raining here in southern West Virginia, at least not at the moment. We've had just an unbelievable. I know the local forecast last evening pointed out that we had 2.5 inches of rain on Monday and 2.5 inches of rain up until 6 p.m. news last evening. And then it rained all night long and all morning long, right up beyond the noon hour today. So I'm guessing we had at least another inch and a half. So we're looking at probably 5.5 to 6 inches of rain over the last 3 days. And there is some flooding in the eastern part of southern West Virginia, in the Lewisburg area in Greenbrier County, just as you cross from Virginia into West Virginia. But it's kind of like, my wife made the point that it's kind of like Seattle, where the weather comes right off the ocean and it just doesn't stop raining. And we're getting that. We usually don't get that. Most of our weather comes from the west or the northwest or the southwest or whatever. But this week, we've been getting our weather off the Atlantic Ocean. There's a low in the Carolinas, which has kind of been sitting there, and it's creating a counterclockwise flow of air, which is basically coming into Virginia and right in through West Virginia and up and around and going back out again. And we've just had almost what seems like an endless flow of moisture coming in. And everybody I talk to says, well, it's really not pleasant, but in July and August we'll be glad we had it. So I guess that's taking lemons and making lemonade out of it, isn't it? It is a pleasure to be with you again today. Let me once again share our phone number with you, and along with my email address, and I want to make comment on a couple of emails that we received since yesterday's program. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. And my email address, my personal email address, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, no dots or anything, all one word, at gmail.com. And as I mentioned the last a few days, and I want to reiterate it again, if you do take the time to send me an email, I promise that I will take the time to answer you. And, in person and hopefully on the air as well. And the folks that did send me emails yesterday, both of them have indicated that they really don't have a problem with me sharing some of the issues that they raise and some of the questions that they raise, and I think they're significant. And since they're driven to a large degree by our program, then it seems to me in perfect sync with what we're doing to make everybody aware of the way some people are dealing with some of the things that we've dealt with so far. I do want to encourage you to feel comfortable calling. I would love to hear from you, and I know that our other listeners would as well. For one thing, it would give them a break from listening to me all that time. And the fact of the matter is, as long as our health holds up and we're able to do it, I don't envision there to being a problem. Some people are, I know that some people get a little bit uncomfortable about maybe, butting in or changing the subject, or they don't want to be responsible for that. And what I'm suggesting to you is you do whatever you feel inclined to do at the moment. Because I can always go back, and what we don't do today, we can do tomorrow, and what we don't do tomorrow, we can do the next day. So the point is that it seems to me the whole purpose of this initiative, this effort, this virtual center for the study of the Constitution, is to basically generate dialogue, generate discussion, and generate reflection, personal reflection on the meaning of the document as, in terms of the way it affects our day-to-day lives. And so I am very interested, and I know most of our listeners are as well, in the way that this material affects your life. And so if it does in a particular way and you feel inclined to share it with the rest of us, I invite you to do that. I don't believe that I tend to be, I don't think I've ever been intentionally hostile to a caller. I try not to be. My feeling is if you take the trouble to listen and to offer an opinion and to share that opinion, then the least we can do is listen to it seriously and give it serious consideration. And that's what I commit to you that we will do. So again, the phone number is area code 304-658-3333. And if you're more comfortable emailing me directly, then by all means feel free to do that. It's waobrien906@gmail.com. Yesterday, as you will recall, we ended our program by adopting the final version of the Articles of Confederation in 1777. And it was a document very similar to, but a scaled-down version of the Dickinson draft of the Articles of Confederation, with a very, very important addition, namely Article 2, which basically put in writing right at the front end of the document. At the very front end of the document is a statement that makes readers very, very clear that power is not expressly granted to the new central government. And again, I want you to be aware that I'm using the word central government advisedly, because the architects of the Articles of Confederation, especially the radicals who were architects of the final draft after the passage of the Thomas Burke Amendment, which became Article 2 in the Articles of Confederation, they were very, very conscious of the idea that they wanted to create a league of friendship in which free and independent states voluntarily entered and, in theory, could voluntarily leave. That's the nature of a confederation or a league of friendship. That's quite different than the Constitution of the United States, and if you think about it, we fought a civil war over that very issue, whether, in fact, Calhoun's position that the Union was a compact of free and independent states, and states that had willingly entered into that compact could just as willingly back out of that compact. And of course, that position was confronted by President Lincoln, who made the point that the Constitution of the United States created a national government ratified by the people of the United States. And the only way that you could change that is via the amendment process within the Constitution itself. And if an independent state or a group of states chose to try to withdraw from the Union, it was not the right of free and independent states to do so. It was rebellion, because it was in direct violation of the will of the people of the United States. And so President Lincoln's position throughout the Civil War was that the southern states did not have the right to secede from the Union, that in effect it put them into a state of rebellion vis-a-vis the Union, and as President of the United States, he had a responsibility to the people who ratified the Constitution to put down that rebellion. And that ultimately was the constitutional scenario which defined I believe one of the lowest points in all of American history, which was the Civil War. But anyway, I mentioned that I did get a couple of emails, and I wanted to, if I can do that, I wanted to share with you the essence of these emails, I'm not going to read them. I guess I could, but I'm not going to do it. Both of them were relatively extensive, and I don't want to. I'm taking them in not in any kind of order or priority or anything else, because they were both, while they were quite different, they were both, I think, superb emails with, and very, very, very insightful and very perceptive, to the point that I wanted to share them with you. The first one came from a listener in Texas, Betsy, who is a school teacher. I've mentioned her before, and I know that she's been a regular participant in the Horn and in Bob Kincaid's programs for a number of months, if not years. And to be very honest with you, that says a lot about her and about the other email that I'm going to make reference to, which comes from Taiwan. But let's look at Betsy's first. And Betsy pointed out that as a teacher, she's been somewhat frustrated by the situation in our schools and the whole idea of education, and extremely frustrated by the fact that the teaching of history per se has been put on the back burner, so to speak, as teachers are required to prepare their students for these standardized tests in math and science and reading and language skills. And of course, as we know, that's the basis on which schools are evaluated. That's the basis on which teachers are evaluated. And so what it suggests is that in order to do well, schools basically marshal all their resources towards preparing students for these tests. And the result is that a subject like history or government or art or music or whatever you might think about that's not on these standardized tests tends to be put into a second-class status in terms of curriculum priority. Betsy suggested that she's looking at an opportunity that she doesn't often have, which is to spend a significant amount of time with students, with two different groups of students. And I got the feeling, I may be wrong, but I got the feeling that not only were these two students in different groups, but they were also different levels in terms of skill levels, that maybe one was a little bit more advanced, or perhaps it was an advanced grade compared to the other one, or whatever. But I got the feeling that she couldn't do the same thing with both groups. But anyway, that's minor. If I'm wrong, I'm sure Betsy will inform me what's correct. But the key point is that she had an opportunity to spend a couple of weeks on some intensive study of history. And she said that while a few of these students were her students from the past and therefore had some basic exposure to history, the fact of the matter is most of these students did not have enough to really justify the fact that they would be taking anything that they would even recognize from before. Some of these students had no history at all. And so basically what she was asking for was the possibility of some ideas or thoughts that I might have on how she could maximize the time that she has with these students in order to put units of study together that would have the most, that would give her the most bang for the buck in a short period of time, very honestly. First of all, I think it's exciting, and if anything, the most positive aspect of her email was that I could pick up kind of between the lines in the tone the fact that Betsy was excited as well. And when teachers get excited about the opportunity to teach, that's tremendous. That's what brings teachers into the classroom in the first place, is that excitement and that enthusiasm. And unfortunately, that's what oftentimes wanes. So when we have a teacher, a long-time teacher like Betsy, with this kind of enthusiasm and this kind of interest in maximizing an opportunity, an instructional opportunity, that first of all, I find it exciting that she's excited. I also find it flattering that she took the time to email me and ask me my thoughts, and I tried to admit, I did respond to her, and I tried to admit that she's being a little bit overly generous, that in effect her day-to-day experiences over the years in dealing with her students probably makes her a much more accomplished teacher than I could ever claim to be. And the mere fact that she is this sensitive and this committed to doing a good job and maximizing the instructional potential of a rather brief period of time suggests to me that she's very, very serious about what she does. And that in itself, I would suggest, suggests very positive things. And so, but again, I was personally flattered that she thought to ask me, and she talked about units on the Constitution and the fact that she was looking at the possibility of dealing with some primary source material with her students. And I responded, in the following way, and I'm not going to read the email that I sent her, but I'm going to try to paraphrase it as best I can, because I think the issue is much more important than the wording of my email, her emails, or anybody's email. One of the experiences that I've had through the PRISM program, and she mentioned the PRISM chats that I know a number of you are familiar with, and I mentioned yesterday we had our chat last Saturday with Jeremy Surrey on nation building and American foreign policy, and I thought it was one of our best, very honestly. But one of the things that I've learned over the 4 years that we've been working on the PRISM West Virginia grant program is that my commitment to the use of primary sources has probably been enhanced tenfold as a result of the experiences that I've had in working with teachers over the last 3 or 4 years. For a long time, I've been an advocate of primary source materials. And I have tried to use as much as I could in the last several years. In my teaching at the college level, I have tried as much as possible to use quotes and to extract paragraphs from key documents without taking instructional time to do an entire document. For example, many of you will remember it took us 3 days, 6 hours to go through Federalist Number 10. Well, obviously, no teacher has that amount of time in a K through 12 instructional situation. So you got to pick and choose, and you got to basically be very, very selective in what you do. And one of the things that I pointed out to her is that if you try to take on too much in a short period of time, you're just going to overwhelm and confuse students, and whatever positive you might get out of it will be lost. So my suggestion is there's nothing wrong with extracting a key paragraph or two from a document. And when you're dealing with somebody, and again, this deals specifically with the 18th century and with those like Madison or Jefferson or Washington or various of that, those people that wrote extensively about some of these really these political issues. And it wasn't just politics. A lot of it was ideology, and a lot of it was, was a product of republicanism and a commitment to republicanism and the idea of creating virtue and all the rest of it. We'll hopefully get into that a little bit today. But the point I would make is that the one thing about Madison is that while he jumps from subject to subject within the same letter, within the same document, you can oftentimes find in Madison enough independence of particular paragraphs that you could almost pull that paragraph out of context and deal with it almost as an independent entity in and of itself. And what that does is it takes away the awesome challenge to students of trying to understand a document that's probably longer than anything that most of them have ever read. And basically what you're doing is reducing it down to a number of lines that gives students a sense of confidence. I can master this. And I think that's important. So that's one of the things I suggested to Betsy. The other thing I suggested, of course, is that when you select a paragraph or an issue or a primary source, it doesn't necessarily have to be a document. It doesn't have to be a letter or a newspaper article or a law that was debated and discussed in the legislature or a particular speech that someone took notes on and entered into the journals. And I'm thinking of Madison's notes on the Constitution of the United States, where Madison's behavior at the Constitutional Convention was such that most of what we know about the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, we know because of the notes, extensive notes taken by James Madison. Now, of course, Madison was a participant. He was the author of the Virginia Plan. He had a dog in that fight. And so what that means is his notes reflected that. You have to be aware that this is not an independent observer taking notes who is totally oblivious to or totally neutral on some of the issues being debated. Much of the notes, many of the notes that Madison is taking from speeches are speeches in reactions to speeches that he had given. And so naturally, if somebody gets up following something that Madison says and disagrees with him, then that's going to be reflected in the way Madison takes the notes. And I think you have to basically accept these with a grain of salt. For example, we talked about the Virginia Plan and the fact that obviously James Madison wrote it. And if you look at his Vices of the Political System, you can see a year before, several months before the convention begins, that Madison is already scoping out the content of the what becomes the Virginia Plan and ends up with revision, this being the Constitution of the United States. An alternative plan was proposed by Pinkerton. Pinckney, rather. I'm sorry, Charles Pinckney. And it is quite similar to Madison's position, but there are specific aspects of Pinckney's position, of Pinckney's proposal, that differ with Madison's. And the reason I mention this is because Pinckney's proposal gets almost no attention at all from Madison. And so consequently, we really don't know the details. We don't know exactly what the proposal proposed by Pinckney was about. What we do know is that in references to it in private letters of other people who were at the convention, we tend to know in general terms what Pinckney was proposing. But you can't depend on Madison to tell you everything that Pinckney is proposing, is because Madison has a vested interest in not giving Pinckney's proposal the attention that it's probably due. And so the result is Madison's position dominates writing and thinking and discussions related to the Constitutional Convention because he controlled the agenda. He was the one that took the most detailed notes, the most detailed minutes of the speeches and conventions. And if somebody like James Wilson of Pennsylvania got up and delivered a speech, chances are what Wilson would say would be very, very much in tune with what Madison believed. So consequently, Madison was very generous in his notes to James Wilson. He was he was less so with those who would object to him. I'm thinking specifically, and the person that I'm most familiar with is an anti-federalist from Maryland named Luther Martin, who was an attorney in Maryland. Luther Martin, when the convention, he was one of the people that left the convention when he realized what was happening. He walked out. And he put together his perceptions and his reaction to Madison's proposals in what he called the genuine information. And his genuine information was published in the Maryland newspapers in series, because there's a lot to it. Not nearly as extensive as the Federalist Papers by any stretch. But the difference is that Luther Martin's genuine information takes on the Constitution article by article and pretty much challenges much of it. It's very obvious that Madison is not going to give a whole lot of attention, a whole lot of credibility to what Luther Martin might say on the floor of the convention before he left, before he walked out. And one can't go by that, because if you read the genuine information, you begin to realize that Luther Martin has one of the most astute political legal minds in America at this time. And a lot of people, Luther Martin's reputation in history has been pretty much besmirched because he was an alcoholic. Apparently, he drank a bit, quite a bit. And of course, those who disagreed with him were inclined to basically suggest that he spent a little bit more time drinking than perhaps he really did. And so the whole idea is that if you portray him as an alcoholic, as a raving alcoholic, and you are successful, then that's going to incline a lot of people who listen to you to not take seriously what he says about the Constitution. In fact, if you read the Genuine Information, which is an anti-federalist alternative to the Federalist Papers, you begin to get a level of insight about the Constitution and about specific provisions in it that are astounding, that are absolutely incredible. And just to give you one piece of little information, it seems like I've lost the point about Betsy's email, but I really haven't forgotten. I do have senior moments, but this is not one of them. But it's been years since I've been into Luther Martin, but I kind of love the substance of his stuff because I find it exciting, and to me it was a whole new thing to realize that anybody this astute, most people go to Patrick Henry because Patrick Henry is such a tremendous orator, and so they look at his speeches, and his speeches are pretty much covered by James Madison, because Madison, even though he disagrees with Henry or Henry disagrees with him, Madison has a tremendous respect for Patrick Henry's oratorical skill as well as his political influence in Virginia. So Madison takes very seriously everything that Patrick Henry says. In fact, at one point, he makes the comment that anybody who wants to get anything through politically in the state of Virginia has to figure out a way to deal with Patrick Henry. And that's quite a compliment to your opponent, it seems to me. It's kind of what many people in the NBA say about LeBron James, for example. I mean, there's no way in the world that you can deny the incredible talent that he has, even though he's your opponent. And I think that Madison giving Patrick Henry those kinds of kudos, it seems to me, speaks a lot about Madison as well as it does Patrick Henry. But anyway, Luther Martin tends not to get the credibility that he deserves, and part of the reason is that those who disagree with him are much more interested in convincing everybody that he's an alcoholic, and therefore you can't really put a whole lot of credibility in what he says. And to be very honest with you, a lot of people don't, and so they don't bother to read him because they figure he's coming off, he's been on a toot, and what he says doesn't make any sense or whatever. When in fact he's one of the most astute, precise legal and political minds that exist in 18th century America. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, a lot of people don't realize this. I was quite surprised by this. The Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, which I think we'll hopefully get to today. The Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, which basically makes the point that all laws in Article 6, that all laws passed by the United States, as far as they are interpreted by courts both at the federal level and at the state levels, will be viewed as the supreme law of the land. And the Supremacy Clause is one of the major, basically what it says is whenever there's a power conflict between the states and the central government, the central government always has to win because its laws are the supreme law of the land. It was Luther Martin that made that proposal. And the most interesting thing is that Martin was very, very concerned. Madison's priority in the convention was to give Congress a veto over state laws. If you remember Madison's vices, he felt that what was coming out of the states was the major weakness of the Articles of Confederation. That's what he wanted to change. So Madison's proposal, and what Madison was trying to get those who agreed with him to buy into, was the idea that one of the things that the central government ought to be given is a veto over all state laws. In other words, the central government could basically strike down any state law that it felt disagreed with or challenged its power, its legitimate power. And Luther Martin was very, very concerned about this, because that would reduce the states almost to nothing politically. And so the idea of a clause, a phrase in the Constitution, which would assert that the laws of the United States would be viewed by the courts as the supreme law of the land, to Luther Martin was a compromise. It was the less of two alternatives that weren't very good as far as he saw it. In other words, in order to prevent the national, what Madison referred to as the national veto, the ability of the national government to veto state laws, Luther Martin said much more acceptable to the states than that would be something in the Constitution about the laws of the laws of the central government passed by Congress being viewed as the supreme law of the land. If he had to pick one, he would rather have the second than the first. And I found that very interesting, because many people point to the supreme law of the land clause, and they don't realize that its insertion into the Constitution was a product of one of the opponents of the Constitution, Luther Martin. I find that very, very interesting. But anyway, back to Betsy's email. So basically what she was talking about was what she might do to maximize the period of time. And she was talking about having 3 hours on a Monday and 3 hours on a Tuesday and 2 hours on a Wednesday with students for a couple of weeks, and how to maximize that time in terms of acquainting these students who are pretty much not been exposed to history at all, and how she could maximize it. Now, I suggested the idea of primary source materials, but the point I was making to her, and the point I wanted to reiterate here, is that primary source materials involve much more than letters and laws and journal entries and all of that stuff. I would suggest to you that paintings and sketches and cartoons and architectural sketches and the structure of buildings, all of these things are what we call artifacts. All of them have something to tell us about the period in which they were created. And if you, and I believe this firmly, and I've said this before, if you believe as I do that the arts, or that art generally, is a window into the soul of a culture, that by looking at its literature, looking at its music, looking at its art, looking at its architecture, looking at its fashion. I have a good friend who did a program for our teachers in 2011 named Pete Ballard, who has been making fashion dolls, 19th century fashion dolls, for the last 30 years. And Pete's dolls are historically accurate. They are primary source materials. To look at these, I mean, he goes out of his way to get the right kinds of fabrics and the right kinds of materials, and he basically has a whole line of dolls that cover the 18 teens and the 1820s and the 1830s and 1840s, and you can go back and look at the fashion in the late 19th century with fashion in the early 19th century and draw some conclusions about it. And he gave an absolutely stellar presentation that was close to 3 hours in the summer of 2011, and our teachers were stunned. I can remember some of the male teachers, some of the guys, saying afterwards, "I didn't. You wouldn't needed a whip to get me to come to a session on fashion." And I sat here for 3 hours. I never heard anything like that in my whole life. That basically what he did is he had diagrams and photographs of gowns and hats and fashion hats and walking outfits and lounging outfits and all of these things that people wore, and he talked about them and how they reflected the priorities of the period. And our teachers were basically stunned, and they said, never would we have ever been exposed to anything like this. The point I'm making is, and what I told Betsy is, that you can mix primary source materials up. You can use documents and use pieces of legislation, of course, but you can use other kinds of artifacts. I mean, you can use military uniforms, weapons, guns, swords, boots, sketches of buildings, sketches of private homes, sketches of public buildings, cartoons, photographs, landscapes. I mean, it's just amazing, because all of these, once people begin to see what these artifacts have to tell us about the period that produced them. And in order to do that, you have to make a distinction between looking and seeing. A lot of us look. Not that many of us see. I'm struck by my first wife, who passed away a number of years ago, was an artist. And I had never been around an artist like Joan was. And we used to look, we would just be walking along and look at the cloud formations in the sky. And she would make comments. And she'd say, "Do you see this?" And I'd have to look, and I'd see, I wouldn't see anything. And then after a while, I began to look, and I would look again, and then very gradually, if I concentrated enough and focused enough, I would begin to see. And I became incredibly respectful of her ability to see things that I didn't see and that most people didn't see. And I began to realize that that's the way an artist sees the world around us. And that's why they're so valuable, because they portray to us a world that most of us don't see. And so there's a skill to transposing looking into seeing. And it's evident in these artifacts. So if a teacher becomes skilled in encouraging students to see things in photographs or pieces of sculpture, for example, the size of the hands, for example, and usually the artist is trying to tell those who will view the piece of art, the artist is trying to send a message. And sometimes it takes a long time to figure out what that message is. But once you find it, it becomes incredibly profound, because it says an awful lot about the priorities of the period which produced it. And so what I was suggesting to Betsy is that if you can put together a conglomeration of different kinds of primary source materials that can be interpreted in a number of different ways, then essentially one of the things that I found is that every student can do this. Every student can see. Every student can't read well. Some students can't read at all. But they can think, and they can see, and they can reason, and they can speculate, and they can hope, and they can dream. And once they do this, and once they are credited for it, they begin to do it more and more and more. The advantage of primary sources is that it allows everybody to participate, not just the top 10% of the most academically skilled, the best readers. And so that's why it's important to get away sometimes from written documents and into some other kind of artifact. Because this approach allows all students, no matter what their skill levels, to participate. And the reality is, and this is what drives the whole process, and it's what brings people into teaching in the first place, it seems to me, there is something exciting about learning. Learning is exciting. It is not dull. And if people are bored about their time in the classroom, it's because there's not enough learning going on. And once students, even the weaker students skill-wise, once students begin to contribute their insights to a group, and they experience not ridicule, which is oftentimes what they get from, when they turn in papers and things, but rather than get ridicule, they get respect and they get response. And the best students will respond very positively to the best insights and the best ideas and the most perceptive comments, whoever they come from. And once a student begins to get feedback like that, education, learning is beginning. That's what you're looking for, is whatever it takes to get these people, these outsiders, in the educational process into the inside. And the way to do it is to just experience a victory or two, a win or two, a comment that people don't laugh at but take very seriously. The power that that carries is immeasurable. And so my feeling is, in the short term, that might be what Betsy might want to do, is find a way to create those kinds of experiences which give students the opportunity to experience something very positive in the educational environment. It may be her only shot. And I'm interested in how she makes out, because again, it's not so much the value of conveying information, because as long as it becomes information from you or from a textbook or a curriculum guide or a State Department of Education or whatever it is, as long as it's information that's supposed to be passed on to students, then it's not theirs. And if it's not theirs, they're less reluctant to engage it. Only the best students can force themselves to engage information that they really don't care about. Had another phone ringing. I'm sorry about that. So anyway, that kind of broke my train of thought a little bit, but that's okay. We've been on this for a long time, but I just wanted to basically share with you what a teacher. Teachers get such a bad rap nowadays in so many different ways. As we point out more and more failures of our educational system, more and more the blame for that seems to go to our teachers. And I want everybody to know that there's a teacher out there in the state of Texas and it's not a new teacher new teachers struggle with teaching strategies and ways to get across information, that kind of thing. We expect that. But a teacher that's been in the business for a while and is still looking at an opportunity like this as just that, an opportunity to teach, is somebody that the last line that I put in my response to Betsy is, if I had children, I'd sure want them to be in your class. I don't even care what the subject is. And when we find teachers like this, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to share this with you today, because wherever you are, there are teachers. And when you find teachers like this, with this kind of enthusiasm and this kind of insight,
we now rejoin the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States with your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien. Here's Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob. And we're at 45 minutes after the hour in our first hour today. And it looks like a gremlin got in. We are live. And I didn't quite know how to respond to that one, except to shut down the system and reboot it and get rid of the gremlin. So I hope we were able to do that. And we've spent pretty much the better part of the first hour on Betsy's email, which I think is very encouraging. I think it's worth every minute of the time that I wanted to give it, and I hope as you listen that you agree as well. I think what she's trying to do is credible. It's creditable. It's credible, obviously, but it's also creditable. It's to be applauded. And the message that I was trying to get across at the very end there when we were interrupted was that if you know teachers in your area who are functioning like this, they need all the support that they can get. And I hope that all of us will kind of be on the lookout for teachers like this. I mentioned another email, and this is a little bit more substantive about what we were dealing with. And this is an email from Taiwan, and of course it's not current based on yesterday's program, because as I mentioned previously, our listener in Taiwan is picking up programs after the fact, that some of them are 2 and 3 days old. And he raises a question telling me a little bit about his background and stuff, and I don't need to share that with you. But one of the things he points out that as an instructor he had in college, in talking about the founders, made a point that a couple of the founders in later life were sharing their thinking on the fact that there was the seed that America, like almost any nation, included the seeds of its own destruction. And the point that these two were agreeing upon, seemingly agreeing upon, was that in the American political structure, and this would have been, these letters would have been exchanged probably in the 1820s, were more, undoubtedly exchanges between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, because that exchange is classic. As you know, for years and years and years after the presidency of John Adams in the late 90s, and then, of course, 8 years of Jefferson's presidency in the early 19th century, Jefferson and Adams weren't speaking, and they were not communicating for a number of years until the very end, when they were both older. They were senior citizens, and they began to exchange ideas and points of view, and they began to rerun, to each other some of the past events that they had both been involved in. And of course, historians love to get their hands on letters like this, because here's the people who did it explaining to other people who were with them and reminding them, this is what we did and this is why we did it. So historians love to get letters like that. And the emailer suggested that at first he thought one of the participants was probably George Washington. But obviously he realizes now that that's not true. Washington died in the 1790s. And so it obviously is an exchange between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And what they were basically focusing on, that in America, the seeds of the destruction of this whole system potentially was slavery. That ultimately, at some point in time, the nation was going to have to deal with the reality of slavery. And how the nation dealt with that, they believed, was going to be the determining factor in how successful the nation would be able to weather the storm and overcome it. And the listener, the emailer, is basically raising some questions about this whole idea of seeds of destruction. In other words, is there indeed an issue, or are there certain issues that seem to jeopardize or threaten the very fiber, the very foundation and structure of a society or a nation? And he begins to speculate about other possibilities other than slavery. And I think the realities of the Civil War suggest that Jefferson and Madison were on target in their agreement that slavery was the issue. But our emailer raises the question of religious freedom versus religious toleration. The whole idea, the religious freedom, religious toleration idea. And he said the more he's thinking about it and the more he reads, the more he's beginning to realize that this issue of religious freedom and people's willingness to tolerate other religions might be our seed of potential destruction. And of course, if you look at it in the modern world today and you see the situation that has rearisen after all of these years between Muslims and Christianity, between Islam and Christianity, and of course that was the issue that drove the Crusades, 1,000 years ago, and it's still going on. And so his position, or his suggestion, is that maybe something related to the ideas of religious toleration and religious freedom might be the seeds that promise the potential destruction of our society as we know it. And I found that to be a really perceptive comment. And that's the kind of thinking, that's the kind of thinking out of the box that listeners to the Horn do. And I think it's to be encouraged, and it's to be acknowledged and applauded. I mean that. And I've done some thinking after I read that email this morning. I've done some thinking on that issue as well. And of course, the reality is, as far as Jefferson and Adams were concerned, Jefferson, along with Madison, was responsible for the Virginia Bill for Religious Freedom in 1786 in Virginia. And they were the ones that came up with the idea of religious freedom, and were able to get through the Virginia legislature prior to the Constitution, by the way. This was during the Confederation. They were able to get legislation through which effectively abolished the idea of a state religion, that up until that time, public taxes were collected to support the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And of course, that was fine at the very beginning when everybody, in fact or in theory at least, was Anglican. But by the time you get into the later 18th century, you've got, especially into the backcountry, into the western regions of Virginia, and what is now West Virginia, and Tennessee and Kentucky and the Carolinas, etc., you begin to get an influx of all different kinds of denominations, Baptists and Methodists and all the rest of them, all of them products of what started as the Protestant Reformation in Europe. The result was that whereas religion can be a unifying factor politically, if everybody is of the same religion, if religion is something that people can agree on, then religion can be a very positive factor in the process of governing. Because one thing that government looks for are elements of agreement within its people. The more government policy and ideas and laws and everything else conform to what people believe, the more stable and governable your society is. So as long as people agree on religion, as long as they are of the same religious persuasion, is the phrase that we use, then religion becomes a glue in building a society, in building a sense of community. But the minute you get the influx of a variety of different kinds of groups, then if you have a number of different religious denominations within the same political entity, within the same colony or the same state or the same county or whatever you're talking about, then the only way that you can govern that particular entity successfully is to downplay religion, because religion is a divisive force rather than a unifying force. And that was the reality in mid-18th century Virginia. And Madison and Jefferson realized it. That as long as you had the colony of Virginia taxing for the support of the Anglican Church, you were getting dissenting opinions from everybody who was required to pay this tax, who was not an Anglican. And that was a potentially very divisive issue. And the example that I would use is Pennsylvania. And if you can remember a couple of weeks ago when we dealt with Benjamin Rush's Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, Rush addresses the issue in Pennsylvania. And he's talking about religion. He's talking about religion as being the principal ingredient of what he believes is the proper mode of education proper in a republic. Because, as he says, a Christian cannot fail of being a Republican for a number of reasons. But in Virginia, you have in Pennsylvania, you have a variety of different people. If you remember your history from grade school, Pennsylvania was founded, of course, by William Penn. And if you remember, in order to encourage settlers to settle in Pennsylvania, William Penn offered religious freedom as a lure, as an attraction to settlers who might want to settle there. And his position is, no matter what branch of Christianity you subscribe to, and of course we know in Pennsylvania there were Jews and and Dutch Reformed and various other groups. And so his position is whatever branch of religion you subscribe to, in Pennsylvania, you would not be discriminated against because of it. And so the result was Pennsylvania became one of the fastest growing and wealthiest colonies because religious freedom was a draw. And that's the model that Jefferson and Madison have in front of them in the mid-1780s when they propose religious toleration in Virginia. And of course, we know that when Jefferson takes over in the White House after the election of 1800, not the White House yet, but when Jefferson takes over as president, actually they were building the White House during the last part of John Adams' administration. When Jefferson takes over, he sends that very famous letter to the Baptists in Connecticut and makes the very famous statement about separation of church and state. And that's just a continuation of the concept that he and Madison had introduced in Virginia. The idea that in order to govern effectively, you've got to separate religion from politics. Because when you have more than one religion, then everything you do that has a religious tone to it is divisive. And so therefore you've got to avoid that kind of thing. So I would offer that to our emailer as a thought. But I think the idea of, given what's going on in the world, it seems to me that the idea of religious intolerance as being the seed of our destruction in the modern world is not something that you can blow off lightly by any stretch. I think it's a very, very perceptive insight. And there were other things in the email as well, but that was the one that I wanted to call attention to because I think it was very profound. One other idea in there that touches on issues that we've been talking about is the Bill of Rights. And he makes the point about the issue of the Bill of Rights vis-a-vis the Constitution. And that's something that I think we probably ought to revisit. But we're at the top of the hour. We've completed half of our time together today. Let's pause and take a 3 or 4 minute break and time to stretch and get a drink of water or whatever, and we'll come back and we'll complete today's program, and we'll begin with this issue of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. We were talking a little bit yesterday about the Bill of Rights, so let's come back to that. We'll be right back. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back with you for our second hour. We're at 6 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 50 minutes or so to spend together today. And for those of you who are just joining us, welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. And for those of you who've been with us through the entire program, thank you for staying with us. I realize that you can leave at any time, or so-called, as they say, change the channel. And the challenge to hopefully make the program rich enough that you don't do that is one of the things that I take very, very seriously. So thank you. And let me again give you our phone number. It's area code 304-658-3333. And my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, the phone number, 304-658-3333. And we were looking at responding to an email that I got, and I appreciate, and one of the things that I want you to know is that I really appreciate the emails, and I want you to know that people take the time to send an email as substantive as these are. They warrant the time, as much time as we can give them in order to do justice to the substance of the particular message. One of the issues that the emailer raised, and I mentioned just before we took our break, was related to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And let me just share that section for you. And of course, he's talking about the idea, the issue of the NRA and the convention over the past weekend and the rest of it. And of course, that refers specifically to the Second Amendment. We gave a little bit of attention to that yesterday. And then the emailer goes on and says, lately I find myself wondering if the Bill of Rights itself and its inclusion in the Constitution as a prerequisite for its adoption might not turn out to be the true seed of the unraveling of the American nation. And I think he's thinking about this fetish that the NRA reflects with the Second Amendment. And I think, the idea of the proposed 10,000 man march on Washington with guns drawn, on July 4th, those kinds of things really frighten a lot. I mean, they frighten me, and I'm sure they frighten a lot of other people, and I know that's the basis for this particular comment. Let me just suggest a couple of things, because I think they're very important, and this is one of the issues that I wanted to go into. We spent a little bit of time yesterday on the Bill of Rights, but we spent most of our time on the Second Amendment, as well as the 10th Amendment and the absence of the word expressly. And I think that's very significant, and that's really where I want to go in the rest of our hour today. But I wanted to deal with the relationship between the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, because I think it's very, very significant. The emailer makes the point that the Bill of Rights became the prerequisite for adoption. And indeed it did. State after state ratified the Constitution, but increasingly it became obvious that these states expected a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution. And many states submitted a list of proposed amendments that they wanted added. And please be aware, I think we all know this, that you can go all the way back to the writing of the state constitutions with the Declaration of Independence in the late 1770s. Once independence is declared, then the Continental Congress puts out the word to the states that it's time to draw up constitutions, because you are no longer colonies of Great Britain, you are now independent states, free and independent states. And that means you need a constitution. So state after state begins to draft constitutions, and some of them are very, very noteworthy, and that's one of the areas that I want to get into is, for example, the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 is quite unique when compared with some of the other state constitutions. The Constitution of Massachusetts, which was drafted principally by John Adams, is considered to be one of the best state constitutions drafted during this period. Interestingly enough, it's also one of the more conservative in a lot of ways. But at this point, I don't necessarily want to get into that as much as I'd like to just respond to the email's comment about the extent to which the Bill of Rights was a prerequisite for ratification or adoption of the Constitution. Because state after state amends amends ratification when they send it into the Congress. They send it in accompanied by a Bill of Rights with full expectation that these rights will be added to the Constitution. And one of the most important figures
We now rejoin Dr. Bill O'Brien. and the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States in progress. Here's Dr. Bill.
It is a pleasure to be back with you. We have about 25 minutes left, 20 minutes left of our program today. We had a few technical difficulties. There seem to be a number of those, but that's the nature of the world we live in, and I think the benefits far outweigh the inconveniences, so not a problem at all. If you recall, when we left you suddenly, talking about the Bill of Rights as a prerequisite to the approval, the ratification of the Constitution. And the point that I was making is that Madison, for a long time, was an opponent of the need for a Bill of Rights. And there are a number of arguments that Madison makes over time against the need for a Bill of Rights. One is that in a popular government, a participatory government, those who would suggest that the government's intent was to in any way tamper with or infringe upon the rights of individual citizens was folly, was indeed not a valid reason for a Bill of Rights. Madison believed that the articulation of rights could backfire, that when you start specifying specific rights, then in effect what you are doing is eliminating rights that you might neglect to include in that list. And so Madison's strategy or thinking was that the best strategy is not to begin defining specific rights at all. And that way the people would have their rights. The third argument that Madison used against the need for a Bill of Rights is that citizens in most states had state Bill of Rights to protect their personal freedoms, their liberties. And since the new federal structure had no intent to infringe upon those rights, then therefore the state Bill of Rights would be indeed sufficient. But the fact of the matter is, as I mentioned before, as the ratification process went on from state to state, it became very obvious to Madison and other Federalists that the absence of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution was actually becoming more of an issue than anything else. And what you began to see are arguments from various quarters that began to argue if the Constitution doesn't need a Bill of Rights, then what's the harm of putting one in there anyway? That was Jefferson's major concern from France, was that the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. So finally, in the Virginia Convention, when ratification was absolutely up in the air, it was very questionable as to whether the Constitution would make it through the Virginia Convention. Madison finally caved and agreed that the first order of business in the new government, once the Constitution was ratified and once the president was inaugurated, the first president, which everybody knew would be George Washington, then the first order of congressional business would be the adoption of a Bill of Rights. And so at that point, Madison became a supporter of a Bill of Rights. And one of the most interesting challenges, it seems to me, is to follow the course of the Bill of Rights through Congress and through the Senate specifically. Because there's absolutely no question. Madison chaired the committee that sifted through the various bills of rights, proposed bills of rights that were submitted by the states with ratification. And he produces 12, which are sent out to the states for ratification. 10 of these are approved, and they become the Bill of Rights that we know. The fact of the matter is, and I want to devote a program at some point in time to the Bill of Rights by comparing the rights as originally proposed with the rights that ultimately are finally approved. because there is a major change in the tone of these rights. I want to give you a sense, just share with you a sense of what I'm talking about by comparing the difference in language and tone, the syntax of rights. And for purposes of discussion, since we just were in this yesterday, let's use yesterday for an example. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is a much more detailed Bill of Rights than statement of rights than was Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, as we know. But basically, the whole idea behind the Bill of Rights is to essentially assert what Jefferson referred to as self-evident truths. So basically, the rights alluded to in this document, as well as in the Declaration, are statements of principle, statements of fact. Here are the articles, just as a couple of examples. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. The second item, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. 3. The principles of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body or individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. And on and on and on. And I want to mention number 6, which I think is important because it mentions a term that I want to throw out there for consideration. Law is the expression of the general will. And the general will is the idea that there is a common sense of agreement or a consensus in any society as to what the right thing is to do. So the fact that law is an expression of the general will means that as much as possible, man-made law must seek to be consistent with a sense of the general will, a sense as to what the people's, the citizenry's general consensus on personal issues is about. If you make a law, pass a law, a man-made law, and it violates or contradicts what people believe the truth is about that particular right or that particular liberty, then the people are obviously not going to endorse it. So the operative principle here is that when man passes a law, as much as possible, it should be in tune with, in consideration of, in support of. It should be symmetrical with what people believe about that general issue, what they refer to as the general will, and that term is Rousseau's term. And we won't necessarily get into that now. But let me compare those statements of fact as to what rights people have with the Bill of Rights as it's finally approved in 1791. Congress shall make no law respecting, this is the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. than the second one we read yesterday, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. The point that I'm making is that the tone of the Bill of Rights, as finally approved, suggests that these rights are political concessions from the Constitution itself. In other words, Congress is basically saying that it will not do something that people are afraid that it might do. But the mere fact that Congress has to assert that it will not do them implies that Congress could have stated just the opposite. In other words, there is nothing in these rights to deny government the right to them other than government's willingness to restrain itself from doing things that it inherently feels it has the right to do. The implication is that these rights are not in any way natural rights or inalienable rights. They are totally opposite to what Jefferson referred to in the Declaration as self-evident truths that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that in order to protect these governments, secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just power, etc., etc., etc. In other words, the rights that Jefferson alludes to in the Declaration of Independence are natural rights that come from the Creator. They are rights that people have because they are people, because they are human beings, because they are alive. As living human beings, every living human being is entitled to these rights, says the Declaration of Independence, says the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in France. But that is not the way our Bill of Rights reads. Our Bill of Rights seems to be a series of statements of self-control on the part of a government with power that seemingly is assumed to potentially be absolute. In other words, Congress is asserting that it will not pass a law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to assembly. In other words, Congress is acknowledging or confirming or asserting self-control. But it is not denying its right to do just the opposite. So, in a sense, the potential to interpret these rights, and I'm considering here the role of the Supreme Court, which we've got to begin to address, it seems to me. The interpretive potential of the Supreme Court in giving credibility and substance to these amendments is critical. I would suggest that if our Bill of Rights, if the first 10 amendments are limits on the power of government, they are self-imposed limits. They are limits which rely principally on the unwillingness of government to violate them, but they do not deny government's right to violate them in times of war or in times of crisis of some sort. In other words, every one of these rights is a civil right. it is not an inalienable right. It is not a natural right. It is not a God-given right. It is a right granted within our political system, presumably for legitimate and important political reasons. It seems to me that in order to understand our Bill of Rights, what we have to do is reflect very carefully on what is called for in order to make a republican form of government work. In other words, if the founders intended to create a republic, and if that republic included the right of the people to choose their representatives, and the right of the people to express an opinion, and the right of the people to organize around candidates and issues, and the right of the people to publish their positions or their points of view on certain issues, and the rights of the people to practice religion or not practice religion as they chose to do so or not do so, it would seem to me that these are limitations on the power of government, but they are self-imposed limitations. In no way can they be interpreted as denying government the power to suspend any of these rights, depending on the circumstances. However, Jefferson's inalienable rights in the Declaration are absolute rights. They are rights that come from God. They are rights that no man, no government, has a right to interfere with. They are rights that come to people simply because they are alive and they live in this society and they are citizens in this society. Therefore, their rights as people must be respected by everyone, including government. There is nothing to that effect in these Bill of Rights. I would suggest that the Bill of Rights, as ultimately drafted, are really not serious limitations on the power of government, but potentially are ingredients of enhancing the power of government. Because by definition, if government has the power to assert that it will abstain from doing certain things, then it also retains the power to assert just the opposite. So in a sense, by the fact that these rights were ratified by the people of the states, the same people that ratified the Constitution, then ultimately, theoretically, according to the principles of Republican theory, these rights come from the people. All power emanates from the people, the sovereignty of the people. So if the people approve these, then what they are doing is agreeing to government's willingness to abstain from trampling on these certain rights and indeed recognizing them. So they become part of the Charter, they become part of the Constitution, but they are add-ons. The Bill of Rights is ratified 3 years, 2.5 years after the Constitution is ratified. One has to conclude that the Founding Fathers did not believe that a Bill of Rights was critical to the operation of the Constitution of the United States. Madison, the architect, the author of the Constitution, of the Virginia Plan, believes when he finally comes around and is willing to support a Bill of Rights, he acknowledges that a Bill of Rights is fine, but he also says that that this government did not intend to infringe on any of these rights. In other words, These rights are not critical to the operation of this political system. It turns out that they were critical to the ratification of this political system, but the Federalists did not see them as critical to the functioning of the Constitution of the United States. I think that is incredibly important. One of the things I want to do at some point in time is go back and compare the wording of these rights and interpret them. I mentioned some time ago that the book on ratification was published in October of 2010, just 2 years ago, by Pauline Maier. And her research was based principally on the research of the Federal Project on Ratification of the Constitution at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. But if you read Pauline Maier's story, there's a gap here. There's a missing part of the story as to what happens in the Senate when the wording of these amendments is transposed from positive statements of principle and fact to statements of abstention, of self-control on the part of government under the Constitution. And again, these people are attorneys, and they are very aware of the interpretive potential of these rights. As we pointed out yesterday, it is not an accident that the word expressly does not appear in the 10th Amendment. I have to believe that it is not an accident the way these amendments are phrased. I think there's something very, very significant here. It's an issue which is yet to be totally fleshed out. There is tremendous research potential and opportunity in looking at the Bill of Rights. We're at 56 minutes after the hour, and we do want to kind of bring the program to an end in time for Bob Kincaid to set up on his program, which begins at the top of the hour. So let me take this opportunity to thank you. Let me, first of all, apologize for the technical interruptions that we had. I think you will realize that after our program yesterday that we have pretty well got a handle. Bob has gotten a pretty good handle on most of these issues. And so we're functioning smoother and smoother as each day goes by. We need to start engaging in dialogue. We need to start turning to you as participants to call the program and offer your points of view and your suggestions and take us from the substance to the implications and the meaning of the substance in our day-to-day lives. And I trust you for a lot of that. I hope that you will have a wonderful rest of the week and that you will be safe. I'm Bill O'Brien. Until the next time we get together, peace, and thank you for being with us.